There are books you don't just read, you endure them, you breathe them, and you inhabit them as if they were a fever dream from which it is impossible to wake. 1955 was the year that world literature changed forever, even if few people knew it at the time. Juan Rulfo, a man of few words but oceanic depth, gave the world a work that, with barely more than 100 pages, managed to condense all the pain, magic, dust, and death of an entire nation. I am referring, of course, to Pedro Paramo, a novel that functions like a labyrinth of echoes where the living and the dead blur together in an eternal embrace of resentment and oblivion. To understand this work, we cannot simply analyze its plot. We must immerse ourselves in its suffocating atmosphere, in that heat of Comala that is described not as a climate but as a judicial sentence. Comala is not a geographic location, it is a state of the soul, a purgatory suspended in time where the voices of the past never stop whispering because they have not found rest. This narrative forces us to question our own perception of reality and identity, leading us by the hand down a path where chronology breaks and space is fragmented. The story begins with a promise, an act of filial piety that turns into a descent into hell. Juan Preciado travels to Comala to fulfill his mother's deathbed request to claim from his father, a man named Pedro Paramo, what belongs to them. This premise seems simple, almost an archetype of the hero's quest, but Rulfo subverts this structure from the very first pages. Juan does not find a vibrant town, but an empty shell, a place where the air feels heavy and shadows have their own voices. The encounter with Abundio, the muleteer who guides him, is the first sign that the rules of the physical world no longer apply. Abundio, who also turns out to be a son of Pedro Paramo, is the first spectre in a long list of apparitions that will weave the web of the story. As Juan moves deeper into the dusty streets, he realizes that the Comala his mother remembered as a green and fertile paradise is now a plain of ash. This inevitably leads us to consider the power of memory and how desire can alter our perception of the truth, transforming a nightmarish place into a lost Eden through the filter of time and affection. But to understand this fully, we must look toward the central figure who gives the work its name. Pedro Paramo is the incarnation of caciquismo, a term defining the system of political and social domination by an omnipotent local leader in rural areas. Pedro is not just a man, he is a force of nature, a landowner whose will shapes the destiny of thousands of people. His surname, Paramo, is no accident, as it evokes the idea of a wasteland, barren, sterile, and abandoned, a fascinating paradox for someone who owned the Media Luna, the most prosperous ranch in the region. The construction of this character is of overwhelming psychological complexity. Pedro is cruel, manipulative, and ambitious, but his primary motor is a desperate and almost childlike love for Susana San Juan. This love, far from redeeming him, condemns him, and, with him, condemns the entire town. When Pedro realizes he cannot possess Susana's soul, he decides to cross his arms and let Comala die of hunger. It is the tantrum of a wrathful god who, upon being rejected, decides to destroy his own creation. This deconstruction of the father figure and of absolute power allows us to reflect on the social structure of post-revolutionary Mexico. The Mexican Revolution, which promised justice and land for the peasants, appears in the novel as a distant noise, an interruption that Pedro Paramo handles with cunning and bribes. Ideals are sold for a few coins, and the structure of oppression simply changes its name but not its essence. This is where Rulfo displays his genius as a social observer, showing us that the true conflict is not in the great battles, but in the slow erosion of human dignity under the weight of private property and religious fanaticism. Religion in Pedro Paramo is another fundamental pillar that we must examine carefully. Father Renteria represents the moral crisis of an institution that has forgotten its mission of comfort to become a tool of control for the ruling classes. Renteria cannot forgive because he himself is trapped in his sins, and his inability to grant absolution condemns the souls of Comala to wander for eternity, repeating their tragedies in an infinite loop. This leads us to a technical aspect that makes this work both a challenge and a delight for any analyst: its fragmented narrative structure. Rulfo abandons the straight line of time. The novel moves forward and backward, jumping from the consciousness of Juan Preciado to that of Pedro Paramo, and suddenly gives us fragments of dialogue from characters who no longer exist. This technique, which experts call nonlinear narration, is not a simple aesthetic whim. It is a faithful representation of how trauma and memory function. Memories do not come to us in an orderly fashion, but as flashes of light or sudden whispers. By breaking chronology, Rulfo forces us to participate actively in the construction of meaning, turning us into detectives of a metaphysical mystery. We must piece together the puzzle to understand that Juan Preciado's death occurs much earlier than we think, and that his voice joins the choir of murmurs filling the air of Comala. Death in this work is not an end, but a state of stagnation where the past is never overcome. The deconstruction of secondary characters is also vital to understanding the magnitude of the tragedy. Characters like Eduviges Diada, Damiana Cisneros, or Dorotea Laquarata are not simple background fillers. Each represents a different facet of dispossession and loneliness. Dorotea, for example, is the figure of absolute frustration, a woman who carried an imaginary child and ends up sharing a grave with Juan Preciado. The image of two corpses conversing beneath the earth is one of the most powerful in world literature. It speaks to a basic human need that transcends life, the need for communication and to be heard. In this sense, the work links to modern psychological studies on grief and the importance of recognizing the other. If there is no one to hear us, do we really exist? Comala is the place where existence fades because communication has become a meaningless echo. But Rulfo's genius is not limited to structure or the psychology of his characters. It resides in his masterful handling of language. The author uses what has been called an essential prose or an economy of language. There are no unnecessary adjectives or ornamental descriptions. Every word has the weight of a stone. Rulfo manages to capture the speech of the Mexican peasant, its rhythm, its cadence, and its melancholy, but elevates it to a universal poetic level. This is what is known as magical realism, although in Rulfo's case, I prefer to call it deep realism. Unlike other authors who use the fantastic as a backdrop, in Rulfo, the supernatural is the only possible way to express a social and spiritual reality that is too painful to be told in a conventional way. The fact that the dead speak is the only way to give voice to those who were silenced in life by the power of Pedro Paramo. If we delve into the symbology, water and drought play a determining role. Comala, in the memories of Juan's mother, Dolores Preciado, is a place of rain and moisture, of green horizons. In the reality of the novel, water has disappeared or is scarce, and what predominates is dust, dry earth, and burning heat. Water symbolizes life, fertility, and divine grace, while dust represents death and condemnation. Pedro Paramo, upon dying, crumbles like a pile of stones, finally integrating into the land he wanted to possess so badly, but could never truly love. This final image of the patriarch's physical disintegration is a powerful metaphor for the futility of earthly power. In the end, no matter how much land you own, the land will end up owning you. It is fascinating to observe how this work, written nearly 70 years ago, remains completely relevant in our contemporary age. If we look closely at pop culture, neuroscience, and modern problems, we find echoes of Comala everywhere. Current neuroscience studies how inherited traumas from our ancestors can affect our behavior and mental health, a concept known in psychology as transgenerational trauma. Juan Preciado arrives in Comala carrying the bitterness and unfulfilled desires of his mother. He is not a blank slate, he is the result of a history of pain that does not belong to him, but that he must resolve. This connection to the past is something that resonates deeply in a modern society desperately seeking to heal its roots and understand its identity in a globalized world that is often empty of real meaning. Furthermore, the concept of Comala as a space of isolation and constant echoes can be compared to the echo chambers of today's social media. We live in an environment where we often only hear the voices of those who think like us, or the whispers of algorithms that return our own obsessions to us, creating a kind of fragmented reality where the truth is hard to reach. Pedro Paramo warns us about the dangers of getting trapped in our own myths and the inability to see the other as a complete human being. The Catequismo of Pedro Paramo has mutated into new forms of digital and economic control, but the essence of domination and human resistance remains the same. Rulfo's relevance also extends to cinema and transmedia storytelling. Great directors have tried to capture the atmosphere of Comala on screen, always facing the challenge of translating into images a work that is purely auditory and sensory. The novel's puzzle-like structure has influenced filmmakers of the caliber of Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino, who play with temporality to generate an experience of total immersion for the viewer. Without Pedro Paramo, it is likely we wouldn't have masterpieces like 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who confessed that discovering Rulfo's novel was what allowed him to find the path to write his own family saga. Rulfo's legacy is an underground river that feeds much of Latin American and world creativity. To understand the magnitude of Pedro Paramo's tragedy, we must pause for a moment on the figure of Susana San Juan. She is perhaps the only character who escapes Pedro's absolute control, and she does so through madness, or rather, through an alternative reality she constructs to protect herself. Susana lives in the memory of her first husband, Florencio, and in the depth of her own inner sea. Her refusal to be possessed by Pedro, even after being taken to the Media Luna, is the purest act of resistance in the novel. She represents the freedom that cannot be chained, not even by the most powerful man in the world. Her death marks the beginning of the end for Comala, as it is the moment when Pedro Paramo loses the only reason he had to keep the town alive. The relationship between Pedro and Susana is a fascinating study of obsession and the difference between loving and possessing. Another theme we must explore is that of guilt and the lack of redemption. In Rulfo's universe, heaven is closed. The characters constantly seek forgiveness, but they encounter a corrupt church or their own inability to forgive themselves. The figure of souls in pain, a concept deeply rooted in Mexican culture and folk Catholicism, takes on an existentialist dimension here. These souls are not waiting for a final judgment. They are trapped in the repetition of their own mistakes. This leads us to a profound reflection on individual and collective responsibility. Is Comala a place cursed by nature, or was it the sum of the small cowardices and great ambitions of its inhabitants that turned it into a hell? The answer, as often happens in great literature, is not simple, but it points toward a biting critique of passivity in the face of injustice. When analyzing the work from a sociological perspective, we cannot ignore the importance of the land. For the peasant of Rulfo's era, the land was not just a means of production, it was their identity, their mother, and their grave. Pedro Paramo, by taking ownership of every acre through deception and violence, strips the inhabitants of Comala of their very essence. The agrarian conflict that beat in the heart of the Mexican Revolution is presented here as an open wound that never healed. The Media Luna is a symbol of the extreme inequality that still plagues many regions of the world today. Reading Rulfo, we face the uncomfortable truth that progress is often built on the corpses of rural communities and their traditions. But despite all the desolation, there is a strange and magnetic beauty in Rulfo's writing. His ability to find poetry in the dust and music in the silence is what makes us return to Pedro Paramo again and again. Each reading reveals a new nuance, a whisper we hadn't heard before. It is a book that requires silence and attention, a rarity in our era of constant distractions and fast consumption. Reading Pedro Paramo is an act of cultural resistance, an invitation to stop and reflect on the fundamental questions of existence. Who are we? Where do we come from? And what do we leave behind when we become Earth? The influence of this work on narrative psychology is also worth mentioning. Narrative experts suggest that the way Rulfo fragments his characters' selves reflects the fragmentation of the human psyche under conditions of extreme stress or trauma. Juan Preciado, at the end of his journey, loses even his own body, becoming pure air, pure murmur. This dissolution of the ego is a recurring theme in Eastern philosophy and in some branches of modern psychology that explore altered states of consciousness. Rulfo, without needing academic training in these areas, managed to intuit profound truths about the fragility of our identity. This inevitably leads us to another crucial aspect, the relationship between landscape and character. In Pedro Paramo, the landscape is not a background, it is a protagonist. Comala interacts with the characters, suffocates them, betrays them. This technique resembles what literary criticism calls the pathetic fallacy, where the environment reflects the emotions of the protagonists. But Rulfo takes it further. The environment doesn't just reflect emotions, it creates them. The heat produces hallucination, the dust produces oblivion. This interdependence between the human being and their environment is a vital lesson in our era of ecological crisis, reminding us that we are not separate entities from the earth we walk upon. To understand the transcendence of this work, we must also consider the biographical context of Juan Rulfo. Orphaned at an early age due to the violence of the Cristero War, Rulfo grew up in an environment marked by death and the loss of family property. These personal experiences filtered into his work, giving it a painful authenticity. He did not write about poverty or death from an ivory tower, but from the wound itself. His subsequent literary silence after publishing Pedro Paramo and The Burning Plain has been the subject of countless speculations. But perhaps the explanation is simple: he had already said it all. He had achieved narrative perfection and felt no need to repeat what was already eternal. Reaching the final stretch of this analysis, we must reflect on the emotional impact that Pedro Paramo leaves on the reader. It is not a reading that leaves you indifferent. Upon closing the book, one feels as though they have walked the streets of Comala, felt the heat on their neck, and heard Dorotea's lament. It is a transformative experience that forces us to look at our own shadows and recognize that, to a large extent, we are all made of the same matter as the dreams and memories of those who preceded us. Rulfo's work is a reminder that literature has the power not only to entertain, but to reveal the most hidden and universal truths of our human condition. The conclusion of this journey through Juan Rulfo's work leads us to a point of profound humility. Pedro Paramo is a monument to the word, a testament to language's capacity to capture the ineffable. Through the story of a cruel cacique and his abandoned son, Rulfo speaks to us of the radical loneliness from which no one escapes. But he also offers us paradoxically a form of companionship. By sharing the murmurs of Comala, we stop being alone in our own search for meaning. The work remains there, immutable as a stone, waiting for new readers to dare to cross the threshold and listen to the voices that the wind could never blow away. The final lesson of Pedro Paramo is that memory is our only refuge against nothingness, even if sometimes that refuge is a prison. As long as there is someone who remembers the name of Pedro Paramo, as long as there is someone who reads Juan Preciado's promise, Comala will continue to exist in Drew Corner of the universe where literature becomes truth. We have explored the sociology, technique, psychology, and legacy of this masterpiece, but the most important part remains the intimate encounter between the text and the one who receives it. In that sacred space, death does not have the last word. It has been an intense journey through the halls of one of the most brilliant minds produced by the Spanish language. Pedro Paramo is not just a Mexican book, it is a heritage of humanity that invites us to embrace our own complexity and not fear the echoes of our past. In the end, like Juan Preciado, we all seek a father, a root, a place to belong, even if that place is made of ash and whispers. And with that deep understanding, we slowly move away from Comala, carrying with us the weight and the light of a story that never stops being told. Thank you for joining me in this long-form analysis of literary immortality. Until the echoes find us again.